Hello again, gang. Welcome back to our Chapter 16 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled The Transformation of the West. The focus question for this section is, how was the West transformed economically and socially in this period? The West in this period was an extremely diverse region, with immigrants coming from all over the United States and beyond. This was the period when Frederick Jackson Turner developed his frontier thesis that we have talked about in our Elements of Historical Theory lectures. The West helped to forge distinctive American qualities as the various cultures and ethnicities that moved into this region slowly merged and amalgamated over time. And the West helped to act as that safety valve that relieved some of the social tensions and pressures in the areas established already in the East. But the West was certainly not empty as America expanded into it. And this political and economic incorporation of the West was part of a larger global process. European powers were doing similar things, and especially in Africa and Asia and Australia as well. The movement in economic and political incorporation into the West required the active intervention of the federal government. Intervention in things like acquiring Indian land and regulating territorial politics, and to distributing land and money to farmers, to railroads, to mining companies. As the United States expanded westward, so too did the size, scope, and influence of the federal government. When one thinks of the West in this period, one thing that does certainly come to mind is farming. And settlers poured into the West in this era and acquired farms under the Homestead Act, which basically gave free land to Western settlers. They helped to produce crops for national and international markets. And these settlers were indeed a diverse group, both Southerners and Northerners, Europeans, especially Germans and Scandinavians, and the Irish, and to some extent even African Americans. Much of the burden to run these farms day to day actually fell to women, as the men were often gone on hunting trips or doing business like taking their products to market or going into town, which was often hundreds of miles away, to get supplies. Many of these women suffered from loneliness and isolation as they were separated from any social circles or any urban things of that nature. This period also saw the proliferation of what became known as bonanza farms, these huge corporate farms that covered thousands of acres and employed large numbers of agricultural wage workers. Although family farms still dominated, especially in the early period of Western expansion, they've reflected how the international economy was becoming more integrated. However, global trends produced an unfavorable climate for small farmers, and the future of Western farming ultimately lay with these giant agricultural enterprises. In places like California, migrant laborers, at this time particularly Chinese immigrants, farmed on giant fruit and vegetable farms, following the ripening crops throughout the harvest season. Of course, perhaps the biggest image that comes to mind when thinking about the West in the second half of the 19th century is the cowboy. And the cowboy was really a product of the cattle kingdom, as it became known, which was actually the corporatization of the cattle industry and beef processing in the United States in this period. And cattle ranching in particular quickly caught hold in the mid-19th century in central Texas. And these blue lines you see here indicate the various cattle trails that these cowboys would take to drive their herds to market in these railroad towns in the Midwest here, that would then send via railroad that product to places in the East, particularly Chicago, which became the center of meat processing in the United States in this period. Cowboys became symbols of freedom in the United States in this period, but the reality was the job was often extremely difficult and low paying, and was certainly not as romantic as Hollywood in the 20th century would lead people to believe. And coupled with this, or as a mirror image, or better yet, a flip side to this image of the freedom-loving cowboy roaming the plains of a basically empty western landscape, was the gradual but inexorable urbanization and corporatization of the West. You had cities like San Francisco, which became a major manufacturing center and a major port, in fact, the major port on the west coast of the United States at the period, and to a lesser extent, cities like Denver and Seattle emerged at this time that also were focal points of economic activity and manufacturing. Large corporate enterprises appeared throughout the West, especially lumber in the Pacific Northwest, mining in the Rocky Mountain regions, and sheep raising down in New Mexico. Of course, we cannot discuss the West without discussing the plight and the issue of the Native Americans of the region. And interesting note, however, is that especially in the Great Plains region, many of those Native Americans there were relative newcomers themselves, as it wasn't until the introduction of the horse in the 15th and 16th centuries, coupled with the rising pressure of English colonization in the East in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, that drove many Indians westward, where they utilized the horse to develop these plains cultures focused around the hunting of the buffalo. And these cultures, by the time of significant westward expansion into their regions in the 19th century, were only a few centuries old themselves. The incorporation of the West, however, changed the world yet again for the Plains Indians in profound ways. As settlers encroached on the region, bloody conflict broke out between the Army and the Plains tribes. The federal government tasked the Army with protecting the interests of settlers in those regions. And of course, settlers' interests more often than not, contradicted the interests of the Native Americans of the region. Of course, I'm sure many of you have heard about the Battle of Little Big Horn, George Armstrong Custer's famous last stand against the Lakota Sioux. This was actually one of the few Indian victories against the Army in this period, and by and large, the Indians did not fare well against the United States Army in the conflicts of the period. The Army also set out to actually destroyed the economic foundation of Indian societies in the area, especially the buffalo. You can see from this image here of a train going through the Great Plains and men actually hanging off the side of it and shooting as many buffalo as they could to deprive the Plains Indians of their primary means of sustenance and the entire basis of their economy and social lives. This period witnessed the profound transformation of Native American life and a transformation of the nature of the relationship between the federal government and Native American tribes. The very idea of freedom for Native Americans centered on preserving their cultural and political autonomy on their ancestral lands. However, nearly all officials believe the federal government should remove the Indians and relocate them to small farms on reservations, which would of course open up the majority of their lands to white American settlement and, of course, big business. Congress actually eliminated the centuries-old treaty system in 1871, where under that system, the federal government negotiated on, at least in theory, an equal footing with Indian tribes as sovereign entities in their own right. That was eliminated, and now the federal government claimed to have sovereignty over these tribes as well. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was established, which helped to build boarding schools to strip Indian children of their culture, and it essentially Americanized them into American culture. This period also saw the passage of the Dawes Act, which broke up the land of nearly all the tribes in the West into parcels redistributed to Indian families, with the remainder, and in fact the majority, sold to white settlers. Native Americans who agreed to these terms could become American citizens, however, which also displays a distinctly racial characteristic here, and this idea of a hierarchy of races. As many of you who may remember from American History 1, although Native Americans to whites at this time were looked down upon and considered lesser than, they were still above many other races, including, of course, African Americans at this time, and especially the Chinese and other Asian immigrants who were coming into the West at this time. So the idea of American Indians acquiring citizenship was at least a begrudging nod to their sense of human rights and their incorporation into American society by the government at the time. Of course, the idea of Native American citizenship at this time re-raised this debate over what exactly it meant to be American and whether Native Americans could actually be assimilated into American culture. The idea of Native American citizenship was contested, even within these Native American groups themselves, and many of them did not want to give up their tribal identity, which was something that the government required of them to do in order to claim citizenship status. The Supreme Court itself questioned whether Indians could ever be recognized as citizens in several of its decisions at this time. And it wasn't until 1924 that Congress extended citizenship to Native Americans across the board. But even into the mid-20th century, some states still did not allow Indians to vote. And I also want to call your attention here to these two images. And these are images representing some Indian boys who were sent to some of these boarding schools established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is, of course, an image of them when they first entered this boarding school. And this, of course, is an image of these same three boys later after they had begun the process of Americanization, which essentially sought to strip this tribal and Native American identity from these Native American peoples. The West has long been imagined as this place of freedom and opportunity that was characterized by violence and lawlessness. This image of the Wild West and the cowboys and Indians theme that dominates that sort of idea. The region was imagined to be immune to Eastern cities' problems in an almost exclusively male space, of course, except for the brothels in the towns. The realities of the West, however, were completely absent from these myths, and really much of what we have grew to understand, particularly in the 20th century, about the West was more of a product of Hollywood imagination than it was any realities on the ground. And this myth making actually began fairly early. You see an image here of Buffalo Bill Cody, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, who was one of the more famous entertainers in the second half of the 19th century, who really was almost single-handedly responsible for developing this image of the Wild West and the cowboys and the Indians themes that he took advantage of in his Wild West shows that traveled around the country, entertaining audiences in every part of the country. And Hollywood in the 20th century latched on to this image that was created by Buffalo Bill Cody and others like him to romanticize this period and lead to lots of misinterpretations and misunderstandings about exactly what Western expansion looked like and what the West looked like in this period itself. With that, we conclude part 4 of our Chapter 16 lecture series. Hold your seats. There is one more part to come, but I promise this will be the last one. Until then, study hard, and I'll see you soon.